Right, welcome everyone to our second call of the year 2026. We're already nearly the middle of January. In terms of our plans for the call today, if I can just share my slides for a moment. As you should be aware, we're going to talk a little bit about DELEG today. Just following up on a request to do so from a few weeks ago. Sara kindly offered to just share some thoughts, delegations, I should say. Sara kindly offered to share some thoughts on DELEG versus non-DELEG approaches that will sort of, I think, blend seamlessly into some more generally on DELEG itself, and then we're open out to include any of sort of potentially Ralf, Tel, Petr, and Paul to add their thoughts to the conversation and just see where that takes us. So that bit will definitely be pretty informal, more a chat in terms of where we are or where people think we are at the moment with DELEG. In response to a request to really look at that, I think just before Christmas, if I remember correctly. Okay, so that's the plan. Hope that makes sense. So without further ado, if I hand over to Sara first to kick off the conversation, and we'll see where it takes us. So Sara, thanks for joining. Over to you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides and hear me.
Yep, all clear.
Great. Okay. So yeah, I've got a few things in this slide set that I'll walk through. So it's a bit of a general overview of where the whole ADoC initiative is. I was going to start with a lightning recap of what we've been calling the ADoX Deployment Initiative that kind of kicked off about 6 months ago. And it was a general effort outside the scope of pure protocol development in response to various operators and zone owners expressing desire that if there are options that they can explore today to deploy encrypted transports between recursives and authoritatives, that they would be interested in looking at them. There were a number of people interested in this effort, but what we found was that it was quite a fragmented effort. There was duplication of effort, and people were looking at doing non-standard things in short term. So what we kicked it off with was a side meeting at IETF 123 in Madrid, and that was in July. We got a bunch of people in a room together, and they shared thoughts and experiences and plans. And I reported on this back in September to this group. So some of the sort of high-level things that came out of that was that there are sort of single-digit encrypted traffic being seen between recursive and authoritatives today. A lot of this comes out of Google, who have implemented unilateral probing, which was defined in RFC 9539. So they basically just probe port 853, and if they can create connections to it, they will try to use encrypted traffic completely opportunistically. They've been doing that for quite a while. Quad 9 turned that on this summer as well. So we have those two resolvers doing probing. And there are a number of other resolver operators who talked about interest in deploying encrypted transports. On the authoritative side, what's available today is mainly kind of experimental deployments. So Beirut has one, Facebook does some encrypted transports, and a few other operators and CCTLDs also have experimental deployments. There are reports on work on progress from PCH, from IBM, NS1, and Cloudflare, who expressed interest in doing this in the future. Since then, we've also had a couple of follow-up meetings to that side meeting. One was at DNS OARC 45, where there were two roundtable discussions over the 2 days of the conference. And another was a BOF that was held at the last RITE meeting. The credit for organising and running these meetings goes to Babak Faraki from Quad 9, who did all the hard work and was there in person for these. We gathered some notes from the meetings and tried to condense them and try and capture some of the highest level concerns that were expressed at the time. So the messages that came out from authoritative operators were really around, obviously, concerns of performance impact, because we know encrypted transports do that. But there were some more nuanced discussions around the subtleties of how to enable it in experimental or test deployments, and perhaps only partially enable it, and then potentially gracefully disable it if you needed to for any reason. So I'll come back to this topic a little bit later. As you would expect, there were concerns around having to do additional certificate management, and they are seeing some demand from customers, but it is limited. So there were questions about outreach around business cases to their customers. On the recursive side, what we heard was one of the things hampering people experimenting was lack of implementation of encrypted transports upstream from recursive resolvers. I think they virtually all these days do downstream encrypted transports, but not all do encrypted transport upstream. And also that there perhaps might not be good enough error reporting or statistics to move forward with experimental deployments. So that feels like a gap on the implementation side. And there were also some quite nuanced discussions around employing encrypted transports and possible interactions with policy and with censorship practices. And this is probably a topic you could do a whole talk on by itself. So I'll just touch on it here and just say it was raised by some operators. Some of the other general things that came out of these discussions was around signaling general failure scenarios. So if you get a signal that an authoritative does encrypted transport, but you can't make a connection, what would be the signaling or problem resolution mechanism there? If authoritatives are having a problem with encrypted and they want to signal to recursives that this is the case, how would you do that? So there were some operational concerns around dealing with failures. And that led on to the more general concept of people are a little reluctant to start experimenting because there isn't guidance, there's no best practice yet because we haven't really got to that stage. So there's a slight chicken and egg problem there, is that we need to gather more data and more guidance and possibly write some documents before people are willing to do deployments. So very similar to what we saw when people were considering doing stub to recursive. It's slightly in contrast to stub to recursive. There was the question of an in-depth threat analysis, which I feel like it was one of the first things that was done for stub to recursive, in that people looked at that threat landscape and modelled it. And the recursive to authoritative ecosystem is much more complex and it's a much harder job to do. And I think that's also something it would be nice to have, but isn't there today. And there were a couple of comments from EU operators saying that regulation in the EU these days is making it harder to innovate because operators are considered part of critical infrastructure and are often penalised for any service outages, and that makes it very hard for them to do experimental deployments outside of the recognition of being part of the critical infrastructure. So that's something it would be good to tackle. So bigger takeaways, we know ADoX, both the protocol and the operational aspects, are much more complex than they were when we were rolling out stub to recursive. DELEG is progressing, but it has dependencies on updates to registries, and so there's still a concern over the timelines for that. It's something that's out of control of the protocol developers, so it's just still a bit of an unknown at the moment. And that there is still a strong desire to start experimenting early, to gather data and operational experience before having to wait for those updates. So operators are willing to look at bridges to a DELEG-like model now. Not all, but some certainly are. So what I wanted to do was sort of circle back and look at where DELEG fits in the solution space that was discussed over several years by the DPRIVE working group before it kind of ground to a halt because it couldn't reach consensus. And this is a slightly simplified model, but it's essentially saying that DELEG is fitting into the space of looking at a new parent-side RR and a new delegation model as the correct protocol evolution to enable encrypted transports and a whole new delegation mechanism for the DNS. So I've got a few slides as to where DELEG is. I will hope that I can see several of the authors of the draft on the call, so I hope they will have comments and can jump in and correct and extend what I'm saying. But I'll just spend sort of 2 or 3 slides talking about where DELEG is. And then I will also touch on an alternative proposal, which has got some attention, which basically sits at the other end of this matrix, which is looking at trying to use existing protocol records to enable an opportunistic transport signaling mechanism that could potentially could extend to something with a much stricter validation policy in it. So I'll start with DELEG. One of the things relevant to this talk is that when the DELEG working group was set up, the charter split the deliverables into several tasks. So there were ones relating to how you just return additional information from a parent about a child. There was ones to do with about how you distribute that, and others to do with performing aliasing. And I have here lumped them into what I am calling the base protocol, which is, you know, the syntax and the semantics of the records that go in the parent. They separated out the use of additional transports into a different deliverable. So I've labeled that here of transports. And what the bulk of the work so far in DELEG has been around is those first 3 deliverables of the base protocol, and not yet have they looked in anger at how to signal additional transports. Okay, so brief history of DELEG. It was formed as a working group 18 months ago after 1 or 2 BOFs. At that point in time, they created some targets for the deliverables, and the targets for the deliverable of the base protocol was June of 2025, with the hope that the transports would be done 6 months later. So one of the first things that happened in the working group is that alongside the original proposal for a new record in the parent, DELEG-like, was an alternative proposal came in, which, if I remember correctly, was called incremental delegation, and proposed a label which effectively was an indirection to a separate namespace for the new delegation mechanism. And the big advantage that was put forward for this is that it required no authoritative side changes to be initially rolled out. It could be optimized with authoritative side changes, but it didn't actually need them. And so the working group spent quite a lot of cycles debating these 2 models back and forth. Eventually, there was a call for adoption, and the original suggestion of a new parent-side record called DELEG was the draft that was adopted. And that was adopted just over 6 months ago, May 2025. And so since then, the working group has been working solely on that solution. As of November, it was at version 06 of that base protocol, and it's really matured. I've picked out 3 things here. These aren't the only things, but I thought I would just pick out 3 things that the working group has invested time in discussing, because they have raised issues that have needed resolving. So the ones that I picked out, and as I say, DELEG authors and contributors, please do jump in. So one of the things that the specification does is it specifies DELEG and DELEG-I RRs. And there was a lot of deliberation around how similar these should be to existing service binding records. At one point, it was sort of very early on, it was proposed we could almost entirely reuse the service binding syntax. But ultimately, the working group decided to make some changes. So there are 2 fields that are in service binding that are not in DELEG because they were deemed not useful or not required. And the second difference is that in the R data field, so it keeps the key value pair structure, same as service binding, but they've actually, working group decided to create a separate registry compared to the key value pairs that are used in the service binding record, so that there was more flexibility and these key value pairs were more specifically relevant to DNS delegation. So that's a divergence from service binding, although they're still very, very similar. The second thing that's had a fair amount of attention from the working group is around what happens in an interaction between a non-DELEG aware resolver and a DELEG only zone. So this is a legacy resolver which doesn't understand DELEG, and it makes a query to an authoritative, and that zone is DELEG only, which is one of the options for the spec. So it can be NS only, so like a legacy zone. It can have both NS and DELEG, or it could just have DELEG records. And there was a various amount of back and forth on this to do with should name servers try and synthesize NS records for backwards compatibility. What does it mean to do that? But ultimately, the working group landed on a decision that in that instance, the authoritative should return the same response as if there were no delegation for that zone. And that, I believe, is what is in version 06. I think there is still a little bit of debate around this, but that seems to be what the working group have settled on as a sort of the cleanest solution. The third area that's got some discussion is around the practicalities and the logistics of rolling this out, because in order to enable DELEG, you need not only to put DELEG records into the parent zone. To protect against downgrade attacks, you also need to enable the ADT bit on at least one DNS key of that parent zone, so that an attacker can't strip out the DELEG record and substitute an unsigned NS record and lead the resolver to think it's a legacy zone. And so the timings of when to do that and implications around the not needing rollovers and how you might roll that back. I think there's still some operational discussions around how to get that right. So beyond that, my sort of take of the latest version is that it has all the basic elements there such that people are now moving forward with implementations. So there are various implementations available in progress. So most notably Bind is working on one, and Not Authoritative, I believe, have not only an implementation, but a test setup. And this is great because you not only need new records in DELEG, you need new behavior in signers and in validators. So getting this code, out there and getting test setups available is great. So I think that's a snapshot of where DELEG is at the moment, is that people are working on implementations. They're going to be looking at the test setups, ironing out bugs, and then at the next stage is, I guess, to evaluate that and to see whether any of that has thrown up problems with the current specification, or whether it's good enough to start, moving forward and potentially thinking about a working group last call on that document. I would love to hear comments from the authors as to their feelings about that. Ralf, please. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so Akamai also has authoritative and recursive implementations. we also have a testbed set up that people can use. We actually tested interoperation with NOT, and I'm using the bind, the dig from the bind implementation a lot to kind of like do stuff. So there is work going on with different people working on implementation, and it's going well. I
Mhm.
think the cases you described, uh, we have settled at least for the protocol document. Um, there is a section on operational considerations that I think we just started and will add to the document. So expect a version oh 07 or something that maybe covers some of that stuff. Um, yeah, that's, I mean, just for the DELEG status.
Mhm. Perhaps a question for you is I'm not sure what the latest position from the chairs or the authors is on when work would start on the encrypted transport. Is it going to wait until the current specification is much more advanced, or would you do a bit of work in parallel? Well, I
So,
don't know if
Sarah,
that's decision or
this is
discussion.
Paul. I'll
Yeah.
jump in. It's not a question from the chairs to just from the chairs to the authors, but in fact from the working group. Everyone realizes that encrypted transport is going to be a very attractive nuisance, just like it was in earlier working groups. So many people have said, until we are really sure that we don't need to be making technical decisions about the DELEG spec itself, we should not start looking at all the difficult parts of encrypted transport and encrypted transport failure. Because one of the things that came up early when people are like, oh, we'll use this for encrypted transport, was doing anything in encrypted transport brings up its own set of failures. And we want those to be segregated from delegation failures. So let's get the DELEG spec finished before we start thinking about a new orthogonal set of possible failures. Everyone agrees on the positive side. It's the negative side that we will get bogged down in, just as it is currently in the DELEG, like the last technical bits are not about what should we be adding, but what should we be looking at for failure cases?
And along those lines, like you also mentioned in your introduction, that while currently the model of DELEG requires a registry update, it's been still an open issue that we're not even touching at the moment about a way to signal in the child that, oh, by the way, here, using the form of DELEG record, here are, a way you could reach encrypted transports. But we're not touching it right now until that way is defined. So.
Okay, so it sounds like you're going to be pretty much at working group last call or beyond before you start actively working on the encrypted transport side of it.
Right. And we do.
Got it.
Yeah,
sorry,
go
Paul.
ahead, Tail.
I was just going to say, and I do think that we are getting close to the point where for last call. We have an interim coming up, and hopefully, we will keep the momentum going into IETF Shenzhen.
Okay.
And since I'm going to be at least currently, it's thought that I might be the author on the encrypted transport document. Someone else might have more energy or different thoughts than I do. My plan is to do the first draft concurrent with the working group last call for the main draft, just in case it brings up anything where someone says, I would want to signal this error in that part of the main protocol, not out here. I suspect it won't be the case, or if it is the case, that will come up much too late, and we'll do an extension. But yeah, so it could be that this document that's sitting on my laptop comes out soon. But again, it's not like we're holding it because we want it to be a surprise. We're holding it because we can't, or I can't possibly believe that it'll be easy to go through, for the same reasons that we had in Deprive, where people say, no, everything must be encrypted. No, like who chooses and how much overhead is allowed is completely orthogonal to the main part of DELEG, which is how is delegation done?
Yep. Okay. And in a sense, that's a nice segue to the second bit of my talk, which muddies the water a bit by going there with the transport signaling draft. So what I was also just going to spend a few slides talking about is an alternative approach, which has a draft which was proposed in DNS op. And this was, it's being sort of called authoritative DNS transport signaling, and it's looking at what could we do today to start exploring the landscape in terms of signaling encrypted transports without requiring DELEG, and could this act as a bridge and an experimental sandbox, if you like, as well as moving encrypted transports forward through operational knowledge. So this draft originally came out in June 2025, and the first version of the draft was basically, its aim was really to be an incremental improvement over unilateral probing by sending a hint in the additional section of an authoritative response, which included a service binding record describing the transport supported by the authoritative name server. So this was, the authors used the term opportunistic to describe being able to push this record back. I think that's since changed because we don't want to confuse that between opportunistic and strict usage profiles. So here I've called it a hint, but the advantage was that the resolver didn't need to do any additional queries. Under the right circumstances, it just got a service binding record back, and knowing that it could completely opportunistically, i.e. willing to fall back to clear text, try an encrypted connection to that name server. After the initial presentations, though, this spawned a lot of discussion, and a lot of operators were like, well, hang on, could you extend this to do something validated that we could then use to do something more interesting? So this is a diagram that we, so for full disclosure, I am now a co-author on that draft, on the O2 version that was published in October, because we were looking at what we wanted to really explore what we could do in this space in the short term. So we put this diagram together that is not, it's not absolutely accurate, but it's trying to lay out the landscape. So on the vertical axis here, you have the options today in terms of what you can do to try and understand and acquire validated signals for encrypted transports. So at the bottom, you have probing, you just test port 853. An unvalidated signal is getting an unsigned service binding record at a name server, for example, through a hint or through an active query. You can go up a step and you could potentially have a resolver actively probe a name server. And if it's signed, it can get a DNSSEC validated service binding record for the name server for a zone. And then if you go a step further and the resolver is willing to do NS revalidation, in other words, query the child, and if the child is signed, it can get DNSSEC signed NS records that confirm that the name server is authoritative for the zone. Then you create what we've called here a validated signal chain, which means that you know the name server is authoritative and you know the name server does encrypted transport because both of those signals are DNSSEC validated. So if a resolver is willing to do the work and gather all of that information, working up that vertical axis there, it can reach a place where it has entirely similar security guarantees on that signal as it would get from a DELEG record in the parent. So that's possible today, but obviously there's overhead there and potential leaks in terms of the queries to the child. Now, what we started exploring when we were looking at this is the x-axis here, which is what you do in terms of the transport you use after you have got a particular signal. So the first 3 steps there are all opportunistic. So depending on whether the signal exists or not, you do clear text, you can try encryption, being willing to fall back to clear text, and you might even have authentication information that you could try to use, but again, you're still willing to fall back to clear text. So that whole left-hand side of the bottom is opportunistic. The right-hand side, which I've called strict, is, and that's done by analogy to the terms that we use for stub to recursive, is if I have a signal that I trust, be it the signal chain or be it a DELEG validated DELEG record, I have the option, I can still do opportunistic at that point, but I do have the option to actually do strict, which means because I know the name server supports encrypted authentication, I can choose to hard fail. And so you have this whole range of possibilities that you can gather various information, and then you can make decisions about the subsequent connection you make. So there'll be a next version of the transport signaling draft where we're going to try and outline all those options, so that and there are some operators and implementers interested in doing experimental implementations of that, so we can start to work out some of the issues. This was a very high level sort of compare and contrast between those 2 alternative approaches. So DELEG, as we know, there's protocol changes, registry changes. We need things to make it deployable. One of the arguments about transport signaling is that it's possible that that can be enabled just by the zone operator. You don't need the zone owner to explicitly opt in. So, for example, somebody like Cloudflare could turn this on for a bunch of the zones by including service binding records for its name servers. A significant difference is the work for the resolver. So obviously, if you're in for DELEG mode, you have to get DELEG, possibly other records. But once you've got the DELEG, you have a significant amount of information. With the transport signaling, you have to gather both service binding records and do NS3 validation. I put a question mark here under the DELEG opportunistic is strict the default, because as Paul has said, there's been some discussion but no decisions about what it means to have a validated DELEG signal and then try and make a decision about whether you do opportunistic or strict. Like I think there was some back and forth over this a while ago, but as you say, that would be a piece of core work for the draft that you're talking about, Paul. With transport signaling, it's, or at least the way I expect it will be described in the next version, it's very much an incremental move towards using strict. In other words, the vast amount of connections would be opportunistic, because in some cases the signals won't be validated, and in others the resolver just may decide that whatever signal it gets, it wants to do opportunistic because it's not willing to hard fail. So some of what the work in that draft is exploring that decision space. As I mentioned, in order to do strict with transport signaling, there is one of the big differences is the requirement for the child zone to be signed. That's not true for DELEG. And it's possibly leaky because you do need queries to the child again for transport signaling. So very much kind of swings and roundabouts when you look at these. So I think this is a bit of a Marmite proposal. There are certain people who are very interested in implementing and playing with this now. There are others who think that all the effort and all the cycles should be put into moving DELEG forward, and that this is a potential distraction. And so there are conflicting views on whether this is useful or not. Paul, please go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but right there, what you just said, Sarah, I think is too limited. And it may be because I had this discussion with Johan, not with you. But it's not that all of the opposition is saying, oh, you should be spending your time on DELEG. There's a fair amount of opposition that says this is unneeded completely. You don't need to do signaling. A resolver can just opportunistically look for protocols and such like that. And so really some of the opposition is just it's not needed. So why do more? Why complicate the DNS protocol even more if a resolver can just do it on its own anyways?
So the reaction to that I've heard is that it would be nice to start learning now what happens to what's involved in having a signal, caching a signal, learning when a signal fails, developing mechanisms to cope with that now, because this does give you the opportunity to do it. This isn't.
But it will.
There's stuff on both sides with this argument.
Yes, and so somebody doing this now would get that a little bit early, but then we would want to do something about that in the standards process. And so it would come to DELEG anyways.
So the argument is this early experimentation and operational experience with this could inform DELEG in a way that would be potentially beneficial, because DELEG may not learn that until further down the line, just because of the limitations of deployment at scale.
But so would opportunistic. And again, that I just wanted to jump in here because you said the opposition was about not doing it to the exclusion, so that people do in DELEG. There are people who also say, don't do it because we can be getting all of the value now with opportunistic probing.
Okay, that's right. Yeah. And I think, the counter argument is if you have a validated signal, which this potentially gives you, that's the one extra bit that you get. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to cut off the rest of the slide.
No, that's very useful. Thanks, Paul. So the additional stuff I was going to say here is that we're already starting here thinking about some of the nuances that will overlap absolutely with the DELEG work. And one of the single biggest feedbacks we've had from authoritative operators is, if you create a signal, please give me control, fine-grained control in that, which is, if there's a validated signal, can I do things like set a percentage of encrypted traffic to be sent to me? So maybe when I actually turn this on, I only want well-behaved resolvers to send me 5% of their encrypted traffic. And then over time, I can ramp that up. If I need to, I can ramp it down. I could possibly use 0% to indicate that I support it, but it's entirely experimental and it might disappear at any point. If you don't have 100%, it's a way for authoritative to signal that resolvers shouldn't hard fail, that they want opportunistic use as opposed to strict. So once you start thinking about this, there's all sorts of possibilities here, and which will be the same considerations, I think, that emerge from the DELEG signal. There's also, at the other end, an authoritative could possibly signal that it only wants to support encrypted traffic. And other thoughts around, should this be TLSA? Should this be Web PKI? These are all, common concerns when you actually start dealing with this signal. So it's all feeding into what, for stuff to recursive, we called them usage models. What does, and as you were saying, Paul, is it what can an authoritative signal and what decisions should a resolver make in terms of providing a service for its users? So I wanted to just wrap up with thoughts about, so we have discussions of signaling, protocol development operational concerns. But what would be the big win for ADoT? And I think that there's a few ways to look at this. The one I'm presenting here is that centralization has drawbacks. We know that. However, for an initial rollout of a new protocol, we saw this with stub to recursive. If you can get a few of the big players to start doing at least opportunistic. So I haven't done the maths, but if you get Google, for example, Cloudflare and PCH on the recursive side, Cloudflare, Akamai, NS1 on the authoritative side, and you combine the traffic that goes between them, if they were willing to all just start doing opportunistic today, the percentage of DNS traffic that would be protected at least from passive surveillance would be really significant. So as the point I'm making here is that I think there is a big win just from opportunistic. So I agree with Paul, that is where we would like to see efforts done before waiting. I suppose my counter-argument is we don't need to wait for DELEG to do that. And potentially with traffic signaling, you can gather even more data along the way. Ralf? Oh, I can't hear you, Ralf.
Okay, sorry, I need to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I think there is no such thing as a well-behaved resolver. All resolvers are bastards that try to make as fast a resolution as possible because that's what they're measured on. And that's why I think, sure, you can have, there are some software out there that are willing to take the hit, but if you are in a commercial environment, even if you have the software that does it, usually you turn it off because you don't want to get hit. Second is we do have an authoritative auth that terminates. Not sure which. I think it's DOQ and DOH. But we are absolutely, how do you say, not willing to just pop that up because that's not how we deal with our customers. This would be only enabled on a per customer basis if customer wants that. So putting the Akamai name there is a bit misleading.
Okay.
And what was the last thing that I wanted to say? I'm having deja vus at the moment, and the deja vu is having pretty much the draft that DELEG is based on was the NS2 draft from 10 April, and that was presented at Deprive 5-6 years ago. Can't recall. If we had by then started working on that stuff, we would have been done by now. And I fear that we are stepping into the same kind of like, this and this and this and this again, and we'll end up with nothing. And that's why my personal opinion is, I mean, we are, as a resolver software developer, you only have so much cycles to put stuff into new things. And opportunistic, the RFC is a couple of years old. I think one resolver vendor that writes software has taken it up. And I mean, sure, Google has infinite compute resources, but I guess they don't care. But the others have not taken it up. And if we then, I mean, if we continue that path, giving people options what to do, we might end up that we have a world where really nothing works. That's why my personal opinion is I'll focus all of my work on DELEG and try to get DELEG into our software and other software and do interop tests and what have you. And hopefully in a couple of years from now, we will have DELEG authenticated encrypted transport because that's the ultimate goal.
So I hear that, and I think that's fine. Somebody said to me the other day, so this transport signaling was also presented to Deprive back at exactly the same time. Everything was thrown in one big bucket and it got mixed together. And their argument was, if we'd started on this then, this would be out and deployed today. So is that a good reason not to start work now if you have a feasible option that there are new implementers willing to look at this? There are new operators willing to look at this.
Let me give you the technical reasons why I think this is worse than DELEG. Because again, told that all resolvers are bastards trying to get at answers fast. And for that to do, you need to minimize the work that you're doing per kind of query that comes in. And the DELEG end proposal with encrypted transport, you'll have kind of like you discover the delegation, and with the delegation, you have the encrypted transport, you have the keys, you have everything. You just can make the connections and do it. Whereas in the other proposal, I first have to look at the additional section, and looking at the additional section is something that is kind of like frowned upon currently for good reasons.
So the additional section proposal is now sort of, it's scoped to a purely opportunistic. So
yeah,
when I showed you that picture, we expect that, or implementers we talked to have said that they would do active probing of service binding so that they can DNS sec resolve it, which is extra queries, and they will do active probing to do NS revalidation. And they might possibly, in early implementations, do allow listing to prime that. Okay, because if you're talking about a subset of resolvers and you want to get information and you want to learn, that's one implementation route you can take to get there. So
it is
not at any point stating that technically this is if you have on a piece of paper protocol options, DELEG is the more formally correct way to do that. Absolutely, I wouldn't argue with it. I think the question is more about pragmatic experimentation where this is useful. But as you say, people have limited cycles. People have to make choices about which one to look at.
And I mean, we agree it's additional queries, and that's something that I've kind of like just.
Ralf, I think you froze for me slightly there, Ralf. I don't know if that was
no,
just.
I'm good. Paul can speak.
Okay. Paul?
So, Sara, thank you for ending with what is the big win state, because, those of us in the trenches in the IETF sometimes miss this. For me, the big win state is more voluntary encryption, because we know that the vast majority of people just don't care. Like, the amount of care has been so low in the, I own a zone, I run resolver, whatever. But some of us do care about if we can do it virtually for free. And that's why I think that the proposal of trying to do things in SVCB records is actually harmful, because it makes it feel for the people who want to actively start working on this now that they should wait for this and not start doing opportunistic probing, which they can do. I think the big win state is not just more encryption, but more encryption that is harmless to the DNS. That if we have more encryption that is harmful because it causes lost connections, or this zone is not resolvable for hours while someone's trying to figure it out, I think that's worse. And I think that having to do things with signaling, in fact, makes it harder. So my preference is still, please start doing opportunistic looking around now, reporting things and saying why you can't report them. To me, I believe the most likely thing that will happen in DELEG and in this proposal, let's say this proposal goes through, DNSOP adopts it, and somehow it finishes before DELEG does, which I'm skeptical of. But let's say that happens. I believe the most likely negative outcome of either of those is we will have missed signaling coming back from the authoritative to the resolver saying, I'm screwed up, you're asking me the wrong thing, or from the resolver to the authoritative saying, you told me to do this, I did it exactly the way you told me, and it's not working for this reason. And I think we will have extensions for that, but I don't think we can predict them all now. So the big win state is getting to that point as soon as possible so that a resolver can safely encrypt where by safely I mean it's not going to screw over their customers.
So in the transport signaling, you have all these possibilities of signals that you can go through. 9 out of 10 of them end in an opportunistic connection. There is only one path that gives you strict, and I honestly don't expect that to be implemented. So this is a full, so my argument is this is absolutely about enabling opportunistic and discovering how and when problems happen, gathering data and beginning to figure out how you manage the different kind of problems you encounter because you're actively encountering them. So that's my alternative take on what you can gather by moving forward with this on a
I'm interested in that
basis.
Because I think you and I want the same thing. I didn't get that from the 0.1 draft. The 0.1 draft to me sounds very much like it is pushing towards strict and making it strict more palatable. Which I think has nothing to do with us, and that's between the Ralphs and the Tails of the world, not us.
So the next version I think will be clearer, and it will be here are all the things you could do as a resolver to discover this, and at every stage you don't have a fully validated chain, so keep doing opportunistic. There is one path that gets you to a validated chain, and if you wanted to, you could do strict. If you really wanted to, and you were prepared to hard fail, that's your option there. Everywhere else, carry on doing opportunistic. So
then what I hope also in the next draft is there is a clearer description of why signaling gets you that without just opportunistically grabbing. So that would be great. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for feedback. I'm looking at the time, Andrew, so I...
No, just briefly, I wonder whether, just reflecting on what the two of you were just discussing there, whether there's a sort of a minimum viable product that could be specified that might give what Paul was describing in terms of early feedback to sort of surface what the issues are. Sort of paraphrasing what Paul said, he said it much better than that and covered more ground, but without adding extra complexity and deflecting people and adding additional work, which might just distract from the big prize.
But any specification is going to distract. If there are operators now who are doing this opportunistically or using the current draft that Sara has, and they are finding problems, they should be reporting them out loud on the DNS op mailing list. That's the way that we will find out what needs to be added to her draft. The thing that worries me is that Sara's draft will delay people from reporting things like that, and we're not going to hear it on the DELEG side either.
Why would it delay it? Because the people who are going to want to play with this,
because your draft hasn't been adopted by the working group. And wait for that.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So fair enough.
Back to politics again.
Back to process, Paul. Back to process.
Yes, thank you. Process is a better word than politics. Thanks.
So I'm happy to wind up there, given the time and all that excellent discussion.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that, Sara.
Stop sharing. There we go.
I know we're tight for time, but can I just see whether, in terms of the more general status or state of play for DELEG, whether any of Tail or Petr or Paul wanted to, or Ralf, sorry, wanted to come in with anything else that perhaps has been overlooked?
No, I mean, we'll have an interim and further discussion on the mailing list, so people are very welcome to join in there.
Okay, maybe I'll put a pointer to the interim with the call recording, etc., just to direct people there that want to get the more detail.
We don't have an interim yet. We're trying to make it so that an interim is attractive, and so we're waiting on additional implementations. But that should be within weeks, if not a month.
I was going to say, because if it's going to happen before Shenzhen, I'm assuming.
Yes.
fairly tight. Yeah,
it would be better to do it with implementations than without.
Yeah. Hard data is always attractive. Brilliant. All right. Well, look, thank you. I hope that was sort of useful and shed some light on where things are and what some of the challenges are. I suppose the obvious comment is if this was easy, it would have been done already. And there have been several tries sort of in around this space, as was discussed in Deprive a few years back, which sadly didn't get to the prize at the end. Okay, well, as I say, I hope that was useful. Let me just very briefly, within the 2 minutes left, if you bear with me a second whilst my slides, if only they'd popped up where they should be. Yeah, that's better. Okay, I won't go through the sort of the weekly news, other than just to say there's been some sort of discussion or some sort of coverage around the piracy shield, which we touched on briefly last week. And there have been some sort of issues with Cloudflare, which you can read at your leisure. As I say, we don't have time to go through that. Plenty of other things for your perusal off the call. I just wanted to highlight the IETF non-com made their announcements a couple of days ago on their decisions for the IAB, for the IESG, as well as the LLC board and the IETF trust. So those are be included in the slides when I share them. So that should be useful. Bunch of other useful things, so interesting things that have happened. But again, no time to run through those this week. A reminder for Shenzhen, as that was mentioned, the sort of super early registration deadline's a couple of weeks away, 26th January. So do bear that in mind if you're attending in person or indeed remotely, if you're not going for a fee waiver. There's a whole load of other things coming up over the next few weeks. Probably the one I mentioned in a couple of weeks, 29th of January, is the DNS for EU stakeholder group. So that will be of interest, I know, to some of the people on this call. And then next week, Gianpaolo is going to sort of give us an update on source privacy and decentralization beyond ECH, just continuing the discussion from the IETF and elsewhere. So that should be a good conversation as well. So thanks to our sponsors, DNS ADoQ, for their support, but I think we're just on time, so we'll leave it there. Hope that was useful. I'll share the notes. Have a great week and catch up next week. But thanks in particular to Sara, Paul, Tail, Petr and Ralf for your input as well. That was a most interesting discussion. Have a great week, everyone. Thanks all.
Thank you. And